Hello, everyone. Cynthia here, and today I want to talk about capitalism a little bit from the perspective of a game designer. And the reason why I say that is because game design is all about understanding incentive systems. You want to incentivize the player to do the thing that you want them to do, which is presumably engage with your game in a way that they find desirable and enjoyable. So sometimes you fail at that, but that's kind of what you're trying to do, is you're trying to understand how can you design your incentive systems in a game to be able to produce the behavior in the people playing it that is generally going to lead to them liking the game for whatever reason. So there's lots of different aspects that go into this, but capitalism is a system, right? It's a way of trying to incentivize something. And what it is, its presumed goal is to incentivize the allocation of resources. That's what an economic system really is kind of fundamentally trying to do, is it's trying to allocate resources, and it wants to do it in a way that is, what's the best way to phrase this? As fair or least prone to abuse as possible, which is really, really hard because people really want to abuse economic systems as much as they can. And so you have to kind of look, like fundamentally the goal is to make as many people lives as sufficiently wealthy as possible, where sufficiently wealthy means that they have enough income to not have to worry about, basic necessities and things like that, and are able to take care of things. So it's about the distribution of resources, and like capitalism does kind of a crummy job at it. Other systems have proven to do worse jobs at it, in part because other systems have proven to decrease resources or other things. Again, it's all about incentives and what are you incentivizing people to do. So I definitely know that there are people that complain about the way capitalism works, but let's kind of look at some of this in terms of how it works. So there's this fundamental idea that the market will kind of push quality up and prices down. These get called the market forces are pushed to do this. So it's the idea that market forces incentivize the narrowest possible profit margins. So profit margin, for those who are unfamiliar, is the idea that you do something at a certain cost, right? Or a certain price point, I should say. And it costs you a certain amount to do that thing. Profit is the difference between those two. So, for example, if I am preparing a dish for you as a chef, right? I have the cost of the materials, the cost of the fuel, the cost to run the equipment, all of those sorts of things. Keeping the ingredients there and purchasing them, having those ingredients prepared, that costs me something. So I can put a price on a price on my labor, and that adds to kind of the cost at the end of what is being paid. But the idea is I have that raw cost of ingredients and tools and stuff. That goes into where I put the price point for this, so that way I can sell it to you and make some amount of money back on top. So like distributors, so for example, something like just to pick it because it's in my head, a Walmart, for example, they have to buy inventory at a certain cost, right? And then they sell it to you at a markup. So that way, so they don't sell it to you at the cost at how much they paid for it, because otherwise they would lose money on it. So they sell it to you based upon how much it cost them, plus a little bit, so that way they can get some income. So that's the profit margin. That's how much profit they are making on it. That might not be the perfect explanation, but that's how I'm going to use it in this. So if I'm not getting it like technically correct for people who have actually like taken serious economics courses, then I apologize. And feel free to put the correct terminology in the comments. But that's how I'm going to use it. So the idea is, the market forces are supposed to incentivize or direct people towards having the narrowest profit margins possible. Now, without these market forces, what people are incentivized to do is to raise those margins as wide as possible, right? To be able to have the lowest cost to them, right? So they're charging, or the amount that they're having to spend to be able to produce whatever it is that you're purchasing. They want that to be as low as possible, and how much you are purchasing it for to be as high as possible. So that's where, without market forces, things go, right? That's the direction that they go. Now, the strongest market force is competition, right? This is what people are generally going to be talking about. So it's competition. So it's people being able to make a choice, right? Because people are generally, not always, but they're generally going to pick the cheapest item. Sometimes they'll pick the one that they believe is the highest quality over the cheapest, but they're generally going to be incentivized to pay the least amount of money for a given product. So if there's two people, say, offering the same product, and it's the exact same product, but one of them charges, a bit less for it, 10% less, they're probably going to get all of the business. So then the other person, if they want to make any money, they have to drop their price at least that much, if not a little bit more, to draw customers to them. So this is a competition, and this is the way that prices go down. This is the force, the market force, that pushes the profit margins down. Now, the issue that we run into, right, is what happens if we don't have those market forces? What are things that can remove those market forces? What are things that can cause this to not happen, right? Because again, like, what people are inclined to do is to offer the worst product they possibly can, because that's usually what's going to make it cheap, right? The cheapest product at the highest price. So you need the market forces to compensate against that, but there's things that can get in the way. So, for example, if there isn't any competition, there can be a couple of reasons for why this happens. Maybe anybody else who's trying to compete just cannot offer a product of, comparable quality, or, they don't have market penetration, so people don't know about them. An important part of capitalism is marketing, is getting people to know about your product, right? So monopolies is one commonly known way of having this. So this is where basically you're the only one in that field. There's usually monopolies are considered a bad thing. However, they are offered on things like patents, right? A patent allows you to be able to say, hey, this is my thing. Nobody else is allowed to make it. I'm the only one who gets to do this. I get to have a monopoly on it. The idea is that this is to reward inventiveness, right? So there's various restrictions around it. Now, we have various problems with patent law, at least in the US, where you get people like squatting on patents so that they can sue people who are trying to do these, actually use the innovations, so that way they can get money. Their entire monetary format is bringing people to suit for using things. We also have a problem with patents for pharmaceuticals, medication, where these patents kind of prevent or allow the pharmaceutical companies, to be able to set the cost wherever they want, the price wherever they want. Another interesting area where we get a sort of pseudo-monopoly actually is with printer ink, right? Because everybody makes their ink cartridges such that you have to buy their ink to be able to work on their printer. So there's not a monopoly in the sense that there's competition among people who make printers. But if you're going to refill your printer with ink, which, you have to do sometimes, you have to buy their ink. So they get to set the price wherever the crap they want, right? As long as it's not ridiculous compared to, another printer manufacturer. So the ink, from what I understand, I could be wrong on this, but from what I understand, the ink itself is pretty cheap. And so you're paying a ridiculous markup to be able to have it work with your printer. So there's potentially a market space out there for somebody to make a more expensive printer that has really cheap ink, right? And selling you, like, imagine if you could spend like $5-10 on printer ink cartridges, or less even, rather than like $60 on them. If depending upon how much the ink actually costs, which again, I've just heard that it doesn't cost very much, that could potentially be a thing. But why would any company do that when all of them can make huge profit margin on their ink? You also get sort of regional monopolies. So things like, if you look at the national scale, there's competition, but within any given region, you don't really have that. So that happens a lot with ISPs, and a lot of people are upset about that. So like, say, Comcast, for example, is really the only broadband provider in this region, or, Time Warner or whatever. There's a number of different companies around, but it's what sort of local broadband you have access to. And you can kind of see what happens when competition gets involved with all the wireless carriers that are all competing with each other. So there's that. Is there actually competition? Something else that's really important is sometimes consumers just don't know what makes a product quality. So there can be a lot of confusion there. There needs to be consumer education for that sometimes. Also, something that can be kind of a parallel to this is that there needs to be transparency about things, so that way people are able to have the information to be able to evaluate stuff. That's really, really important. If people don't have information about a product, then they're not able to make an informed decision, and so they're not really able to evaluate quality. So it's not just like education in terms of being able to know what makes something quality, but it's also having the information to be able to make that determination. And then something else that's extremely important is being able to negotiate, right? If a product is non-negotiable, then there's not really, the consumer can't say no. They have to purchase the product. So this is something where you might think, how would that happen? But things like food and especially medicine really fall into this category. Can you really put a price on healthcare? It doesn't really give you the ability to say no, right? And what's particularly bad about healthcare is that how much anything costs is super opaque. Like, there's complicated webs of negotiations with the insurance companies, and so how much any particular operation costs is unknown until they've done it often. And one of the things that you run into also is consumers are just really distanced from their healthcare because they're paying for insurance rather than their healthcare directly. And because of that, it becomes, people have a tendency to blame the insurance companies for the prices when the insurance company prices probably to some degree reflect the costs of healthcare. And so if insurance costs are going up, that might just be because the cost of healthcare is going up. So if these market forces aren't working, if there's something that prevents the consumer from being able to make an educated decision, if there's not real competition, so things like opaque prices, or if the consumer doesn't have the ability to negotiate and say no to a product, like I don't have to go and buy any particular video game, for example. And so if people want to price a video game beyond what I think is reasonable for it, I just don't buy it. And so they have to, in order to be able to sell it, they have to make it appealing from that standpoint. But something like food, you know, we need to have food to survive. So there's certain, and food at least tends to have an okay amount of competition to keep prices down. But medication in the healthcare industry is really where we have severe problems in this country with that sort of thing. And part of it's due to opacity. But you need these things to be able to happen, to be able to have the market forces that push those profit margins down, to be able to have quality be good enough, and prices that are, affordable. So, there's some other tangent that I had I wanted to go on here, but it slips my mind at the moment. But anyway, so yeah, it was regulation. So regulation is important to be able to have these things work. Like the purpose of regulation, in my opinion, in capitalism is to make sure that you actually have competition happening. And that is like, if it's not doing that, if it's stifling competition or other things, then it's a huge problem. So, for example, I have no problem with municipal broadband. I think that broadband companies should, be able to undercut what the government is able to provide, or at least they should, be able to. Or they should have to at least have some competition and things like that. But I mean, there's whole debates about what the best way of trying to take care of any particular issue is, whether or not the free market can provide solutions for it. But again, that's all about, is the free market incentivized to provide solutions? The other thing that I think is really important to bring up, actually, is that capitalism has holes, and the biggest hole that capitalism has is that it is a system that works well if you're able to succeed in it, but it does not work well at all if you're not able to succeed in it. So if for some reason you're unable to participate in capitalism in the way that allows you to be able to be successful, where, frankly, I'm saying successful as in able to survive, then you run into some very serious problems. So this is where it really needs charity to come alongside of it. And this is part of where we have a lot of debate about things like social safety nets. So how should healthcare be paid for example? And the whole system that we have, from what I understand, the whole system that we have in the US of having a job basically provide your health care came about in World War II when there were wage caps, and companies were like, well, how do we incentivize people to work for us? Like, how can we increase wages without increasing wages? And they came up with the idea of offering to pay for things like dental plans and health insurance plans, right? The benefits package. And that is how we kind of backed into the way we handle healthcare in this country. Is my understanding of it. I could be wrong on that. But it's just like we've backed into so many things in this country, like Social Security numbers being basically a national identification number, even though they were never designed for that and have no inbuilt security, and they're terrible for that purpose. But national number like that would be friggin', I don't know, communist or something. So we couldn't have that. Anyway, that's an entirely different rant for a different day. But taking care of the people who have failed at capitalism while not, like, it's this very difficult balancing act to have. And I think that's probably one of the hardest parts of capitalism, is what do we do for those people for whom capitalism has failed them? Or, yeah, I mean, that's really the way to put it, right? And that's a hard discussion that we need to have. And figuring out what the correct response is difficult. And having sympathy for those people is really important. And I definitely think that there's things that we could be doing in our education system as well that help with a lot of things around how capitalism works. But that's another discussion for another day. This has probably gone on long enough, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. And until next time, everyone, take care. Bye-bye.